Hello, and welcome to our session, Understanding Public Investment. This is a short 45-minute long session to help busy policymakers think through local growth interventions. I'm Megan Strab. I'm Deputy Director of Outreach at the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth. We help to make local growth policy more cost-effective through better use of evidence and evaluation. Now, today's session is going to focus on how to understand public investment and the available data around it in advance of our new how-to guide on investment more broadly. After the presentation, we are going to have a Q&A, so please do submit your questions throughout, both during the presentation as well as during the Q&A. And without any further ado, I would like to welcome our Deputy Director of Evidence, Victoria Sutherland.
Thank you, Megan, and welcome everyone. Okay. So we're going to talk about public investment today, and as Megan said, this it draws on some work that we've been doing in relation to putting together a guide to thinking about investment in your local economy. We did a Lunch and Learn a fortnight ago where we looked at business investment. So I'm going to work on the assumption that a lot of people who have joined us today were also at that session. If you weren't, there was lots of really great discussion at the end. So I encourage you to go have a look at that. Okay, so what do we mean by public investment? What we mean here is that we're investing in the capital stocks that government, whether that's central government or local government, provides and maintains for the benefit of society. Okay, so that could be a road, a rail line, a hospital, a school. Okay, so there's a kind of contrast with business investment that we looked at a fortnight ago. So when we were looking at business investment, what we were looking at were what were the capital stocks that businesses were investing into in order for them to generate higher revenue, higher profits, etc., and that they had economic benefits. Okay, so broadly, they tend to contribute to output and to productivity. Okay, so if you've bought a new piece of machinery, you can either produce more than you could before, or perhaps you're producing the same amount, but much more efficiently, much more productively. Okay. When we think about public investment or public capital stocks, some of these are going to be used in the production of goods and services. Okay, so when we think about transport infrastructure or broadband infrastructure or energy infrastructure, this is contributing to the production of goods and services in your local economy and across the UK economy as a whole. But actually, we invest in lots of public capital stocks. We do lots of public investment for other reasons too. You know, so there's definitely an economic benefit to investing in hospitals or other bits of the health system, in that it keeps people healthy, keeps them in work, so they, can produce goods and services. But that's not the only reason, and I would actually argue that's not the main reason that we invest in hospitals and other health infrastructure. We do it because of the health and the well-being outcomes. Similarly, when we think about a lot of our education infrastructure, we're doing that for a real mix of different outcomes. So I think that's something that's useful to kind of hold in mind as we go through today's section. The thing that isn't different, though, is that when we're talking about investment, we are looking at both tangible and intangible capital stocks. So tangible is broadly anything that you can kind of touch. So we're talking about buildings, machinery, equipment. So it's easy to think about the hospital building, but the hospital's actually also full of an awful lot of very complex equipment and machinery, whether that's an MRI scanner or whether it's a drip or whether, there's all sorts of different tangible equipment that you're going to have. Intangible is anything that's kind of non-physical, you can't touch it. So things like software, R&D. In the private sector, we often talk about things like branding and design. We tend to be a little bit less interested in that in relation to public investment, but there will be some, use cases within that. So when we think about kind of public, so this doesn't happen at the local level so much, but actually we invest as a country quite a lot in R&D, which helps go on to create new technologies, new products that have an impact on our economies. Okay, so tangible and intangible. There are a couple of things that are kind of unique to thinking about public investment that I think are useful for us to talk through. So a term that some of you will be familiar with is a public good. Okay, so when something is a pure public good, and capital stocks are one of those, so a pure public capital stock, sorry, it has two kind of important characteristics. So one is you can't exclude anyone from using it, okay? And the other one is that it's what we call non-rivalrous. So what that means is that it can be used by multiple individuals or multiple businesses at the same time without reducing the availability, okay? So these are kind of important characteristics of public goods, but what we know is that they're often not true in practice. So a lot of public investment is into things that are only partially excludable or partially rival, okay, or partially non-excludable, partially non-rival, depending on which way you want to think about it. So I think the easiest example for that is we build roads, and in the main in this country, they're non-excludable, so anyone can use the road, okay? It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, what your characteristics are, but we do very occasionally make that excludable. So we have at various points built some bridges using PFI, where what we've done to recoup the cost of building that bridge is we've put a toll on it. Similarly, in other countries, there can be, so for example, in France, there's tolls on some of the motorways, okay? So a lot of public capital stock will be partly excludable, okay? So it's not everybody can use it. You're putting some kind of barrier in. What's more common actually is that it will be partially rival, okay? So this concept of multiple people can use it at the same time, it doesn't reduce availability. We all know that's not true. If there are lots of cars on the road at the same time, you reach a kind of capacity level, so you quite often end up with quite bad congestion on particular bits of our public infrastructure. I think the other concept that's useful to think about when thinking about public investment is this idea of crowding in and crowding out. Okay, so what we're saying here is the public sector does not exist in a vacuum. Its behaviour in relation to investment has an impact on the behaviour of the private sector as well. And that can be either positive or negative. Okay, so if we think about the positive example, public investment can sometimes crowd in private investment. So if we think about something that we've done historically quite a lot of, so for example, through enterprise zones and other regeneration schemes, is often we might have an ex-industrial site that has kind of levels of perhaps contamination, perhaps doesn't have the best connectivity, and we'll often invest money into that site, around decontamination, improving transport connectivity, perhaps improving digital connectivity, getting the right electricity, water, all of that infrastructure in place. And what that does is that then gives businesses confidence to invest. So we've made some investment, and that then encourages businesses to go on and invest in buildings and machinery and other capital stock in relation that side. So that's the positive side. The negative side is that sometimes public investment can crowd out private investment. Okay, so the classic economic kind of mechanism here is that if government borrows a lot of money in order to invest in public infrastructure, then all else being equal, that will push up interest rates. And that makes projects in the private sector less viable because they similarly are having to pay more for the capital that they need for their projects. That's obviously not something that most local areas have any kind of input on. And even if it was, a larger area, it wouldn't make that much of an impact on something like interest rates at the national level. So actually the bigger issue for local government is thinking about competition. So we've definitely seen over, various periods, local government being much more interested in actually doing commercial and industrial development themselves, perhaps often where there is a market failure. It's felt like, the market isn't quite strong enough for the private sector, or the private sector can be convinced to develop, new offices or new industrial sites, and the public sector will step in to do that. The challenge there is that, perhaps a private sector project was almost there, but as soon as they knew that there was a public sector project coming along, they knew they wouldn't be able to compete, and therefore they underinvest. We see this also a little bit in relation to housing investment. So that's the negative. That's the one that we need to be kind of careful of. So finally, just before we look at a little bit of data, I wanted to talk about why public investment is important for local economies. There's essentially kind of 3 different ways in which public investment can contribute towards a local economy. And I suppose this isn't strictly speaking true, but I kind of think of them as being like short term, medium term, and long term. The last 2 categories get a little bit fuzzy. So the short term impact is if it is something that is that has a large construction element, what you're often going to see is that you're going to see that investment is going to increase local output. So if we think about building a hospital or building a road or building a rail line, there's often going to be lots of jobs created within the area. So there's an actual kind of output. Your output will increase over the period. So this is less true if it is a small project, but especially where you have quite large projects, it can make quite a big difference to output. The second thing is that investment can improve productivity. Okay, so if we think about a business and its access to market and its access to labour, then actually improving transport infrastructure can help contribute to that. At the national level, a really classic one that we think about is if government invests in R&D in the public sector, that can then go on to create new technologies or new products that businesses can adopt. Okay, so we'll get, if we just think about the productivity gains that potentially have come through a lot of the IT developments that we've seen over the last generation, they've made businesses much more productive. So that's kind of the medium to long term one, because it tends to affect the businesses that you've already got. And then over the slightly longer term, it might actually change kind of like the businesses that get started up or that get grown in the future. Your longer term one, so this is a kind of induced change, is that actually the investment leads to changes in behaviour over the long term. So for example, if you had investment in transport system, and I just want to reiterate that this isn't all about transport, it's just that the transport ones are really kind of easy examples to think about. If you improve transport connections, That over the long term is going to affect the decisions that individuals and businesses make about where to locate. So where to live in the case of individuals, and where to locate their offices, their research facilities, their manufacturing plants, etc., for businesses. So if you think about that, improved transport infrastructure potentially leads to more businesses locating. That then pulls in more residents. Those residents spend money likely, so that creates additional jobs kind of through multiplier effects and through supply chains, etc. So these are the three different ways in which public investment can impact on local economies. So not last week, a fortnight ago when we did the business investment, we talked a bit about the data that exists on investment overall within a local economy. So there is this data set called, just for those that weren't with us, or for those who need a little bit of a recap, there is a data set that ONS publishes that's called gross fixed capital formation, and that's available down to the ITL3 level. So for larger local authorities, your ITL3 is nearly always the same as the local authority boundaries. If you're a smaller district, it might be that you're grouped with one of your neighbours. But really quite granular data, you can get it by sector, you can get it by type of investment. So is it investment into buildings, or is it investment into ICT, or is it investment into intangibles? So you get good breakdowns within it. But the challenge with it is it only looks at the economy as a whole. So it includes business investment, investment by households. So for example, if you did I think I said this last time, Megan's just had a new kitchen built, so that kind of investment, and investment by government. But it doesn't break it out into the component parts. So we have a real gap there. Now, we do at the national level have a breakdown across government spend versus household spend versus business spend. So you could look at that, and that will give you a little bit, if you combine that with your local data, you'd know, if you were at the national level, roughly how much would be being spent. But you don't actually know whether your proportions are the same as the national level. It might be that actually you have much higher business investment or much lower business investment, and similar for households and government. So that then raises the question about, well, what data can we get that just looks at public investments? And I'm afraid my news here isn't particularly good, which is that actually the data isn't great. Okay, although in a minute or two, I'm going to talk about why I'm not necessarily sure that's a complete disaster. So we have got various data sets, but I kind of fundamentally feel that none of them really answer the question that we really have. So for example, there is this great data set. I actually really like this data set from Treasury that's called Public Expenditure Statistical Analysis. So what this does is it tells you about how much is being spent by the public sector, okay? And it's got nice breakdowns across different kinds of functions, so in education, it's got kind of breakdowns across a number of different dimensions. But the real challenge is it's only available at the regional level, okay? So I feel like I say everything I run, I used to work in the Northeast. We're relatively lucky in the Northeast. So I work for the LEP, but it's the same geography as the Combined Authority now. We're pretty lucky because we were 70% of the Northeast region, okay? So it wasn't ideal, but when we looked at regional data, it was a pretty good proxy for what was happening within our area. But for most other English regions and the 3 devolved nations, that's not true. That actually you're a small part of a much larger whole. So this is a great data set, but it's just not granular enough. You can then get other kinds of data, but in those cases, it doesn't tell you the full picture. So for example, MHCLG publishes data on local authority capital expenditure and receipts. And I should say, when it says local authorities, it's actually not just the districts and the unitaries and the counties. It also has like the fire and rescue in there. So it's got a few other kind of categories in there. This is useful because this tells you a bit about what local government is spending. Okay, you can see here that, so this is for East Mids. You can see that actually housing is by far the largest area of capital expenditure for the East Midlands County Combined Authority, kind of local authorities. This is by far amongst the most difficult data sets I've ever worked with. I find it almost impossible. Like Megan will tell you, when I was pulling together this chart, I nearly lost my mind. Like it's an extremely clunky data set, but also it only gives you this very partial picture. Okay, so these are kind of our trade-offs. You can sometimes get stuff that's not granular enough, and then sometimes we're getting other stuff and it's too granular in a way. We also get some data on what are the actual capital stocks. So the investment is the flow. That's what we're doing to add to the capital stocks. The capital stocks are what we've already got. Okay, so you can do this for some other departments as well. So DESNES, you can look at Ofcom stuff on kind of broadband infrastructure. But I've just put up some examples from Department for Transport. So Department for Transport can give you data on all sorts of things, like, how many miles of roads are there in any local authority area? What is, what's the quality of those roads? So roads get ranked kind of from A downwards. They can tell you how many carriages in the tram and metro fleets are there in each of the different urban areas that have them. You can have, like how many stops there are, although I don't know why that's a data set. I would assume someone could just count that. So there's stuff on capital stocks as well. But here's the thing I think about this data. I'm not sure. You could do a really good job and you could analyse all of this data for your local area. And in a sense, it's most probably stuff that you guys should all kind of know and understand about your local area. I don't think any of this would fundamentally allow you to make a case for, we need investment X, and the impact of that would be, Y. Like the case for, investment in an additional metro line doesn't come from the fact that, that you have 40 carriages of light rail, or that public investment is lower in your area than it is in another area. So I just think you can analyse this data, but I don't actually think it is particularly helpful for most policies. The stuff there that in some cases is going to be a useful nugget to put in, but it just doesn't really fundamentally kind of make the case. So we would argue that actually, instead of focusing on the data on investment, that when you're thinking about public investment, actually often what you're going to want to do is look at a whole host of other evidence. Okay, so I would want to put whatever I understood about current levels of investment within the context of understanding what is happening with GVA, what is happening with productivity, what is happening with skills, perhaps in my local area, alongside a whole bunch of other evidence. So a lot of the making an economic case for investment is actually not necessarily even about data. The data is going to be part of your story, but actually often there's going to be a kind of strategic case that relies on other evidence, perhaps from your local business base, from kind of pest analysis or pestle analysis, all these kinds of things. Okay, I think when we're thinking about needs, as well as having quite a diverse evidence base, I think it's really important to have a really clear logic model. So when you're thinking about the outcomes that you're trying to deliver, having a really clear sense of how the investment is going to deliver against that. And I think the other thing that you're always going to have to do with public investment is that you're going to have to demonstrate that there's been a market failure. So a lot of that goes back to our kind of discussion about crowding in and crowding out earlier. You have to demonstrate that actually you're not crowding out private investment. And in fact, that this is something that wouldn't happen if the public sector didn't intervene. So I think understanding need's the first part of it. But I think, or sorry, identifying need. The other part of it that I think is really, really important is really thinking through how you think this intervention is going to contribute to the outcome. So it goes back to the point that I made earlier about the logic model, about having that really kind of clear sense. So what I've done here is this is the same text as I had earlier on the slide about how does public investment contribute to local economic performance. So you remember I talked about, we've got this short-term thing about it can contribute to local output. We've got a more kind of medium-term thing about improving the productivity of existing businesses. And then we've got this longer term, it potentially might change behaviour, either of individuals or businesses. So I really think if you've got an investment project, that it is worth really focusing on this, focusing on really understanding in which ways is a project going to contribute. So is it actually all going to be about the construction phase at the beginning? Okay. Or is this a thing that is going to change the productivity of your existing businesses? And if so, how? Like, what are the mechanisms by which it's going? So I think if you can actually flesh this out and think about what evidence that you have for each of these, sometimes that's going to be local evidence. Sometimes it's potentially going to be something at a national level where you can kind of use that as a ready reckoner for what might the impact be at your local level. But I think this is a really good place for starting to think about the impact of projects. Once you've kind of figured out where it's going to happen, there's lots of things that can affect the scale of the impact that a public investment project can have. So I think I've put here like a whole list of things to think about. So dead weight is a really important one. In particular, if you think there is a risk that you're going to crowd out private investment, then that's a real potential, source of dead weight. Think about multiplier effects, okay? So just because you're going to get, direct jobs or direct output created by the project, that's not necessarily the end of it. It might be that those then develop supply chains, or it might be that the people who, gain employment as a result of that project then go on to spend their money in the local economy. So you've got kind of different mechanisms by which the multiplier effects might play out. You might also have displacement or leakage. So, transport investment is a classic one here, because especially the road network is a network. Often the benefits don't accrue to the places nearest that actual road investment, but they accrue to places elsewhere within the system. Okay, so really kind of thinking about where are the benefits going to accrue, not just kind of that they are going to accrue. And then finally, so we're thinking about distributional impacts. Okay, so what we really want to understand here is who's going to benefit and who's going to have a disbenefit. Okay, so a classic one is, and again, I'm going to use the transport example just because they're conceptually the easiest ones to get your head around. Like if you build so say there's a new train line and there's a new train stop, okay. If you own property near that, you're nearly always going to benefit from that, okay. So we call that catalyzation. So the benefits of the train line or the tram line or the guided busway accrue to those that have properties near, because it's improving their access, to employment opportunities, social opportunities, etc. If you are, however, a renter, you must probably have a disbenefit because the cost of your rent has now gone up. Okay, that applies both for residential property, but it also applies for commercial property. Okay, so we'll often see that there will be public investment that improves perhaps the quality of a town centre or its connectivity, and that benefits some groups and not others. Okay, so I think it's worth thinking about that and thinking about whether you need to do anything to mitigate that. A final thing that I want to make the point about is even when we make quite substantial investments into public capital goods, you might not necessarily see a really big impact on your local economy. Okay, and the reason for that is we actually already have an awful lot of public capital stock. Okay, so we think about our mental models about how a lot of this stuff works. We kind of think about a world where there are no roads and then go to a world where we have a roads network. Okay, but that in 2026 is not what we're doing. We've got a pretty comprehensive roads network across the UK and within each local authority areas. And in most places, what we're doing is we're just making a very incremental improvement to that infrastructure. And therefore, because we've got so much public capital stock, improvements to it are kind of incremental, and therefore they don't tend to have a massive impact. Now, the size of the impact is going to depend on the size of the underlying stock, the size of the investment, the size of the local economy, but also the elasticities of demand in relation to these different things. So if you're actually interested in this, there is a thing called growth accounting that can help you kind of quantify that. Okay, and then my very final thing, and then we'll break for Q&A. So if you haven't put one in the chat yet, please do. Actually, don't put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A box. Sorry, that was confusing. Is that when you're thinking about impact, I would really encourage you to go look at the valuation evidence of the impact of similar previous projects. Okay, so this is at the core of what a What Works Centre does. We look at the valuation evidence and we synthesize that. So a good example, again, to use transport, is we did a few years ago a rapid evidence review looking at rail investment, and I'm not going to run through them, but I've put some of the kind of headline findings from that. So when you're doing a project, it's always worth thinking about where have similar projects been done before in the past, and what does the valuation evidence tell us about this? So when we did this, one of the things that we found is that there's pretty mixed evidence on whether rail investment actually leads to new additional jobs and higher business numbers. So you sometimes saw that as an impact, but absolutely not everywhere. The evidence was pretty mixed on whether you actually. So if you're building that rail line in order to deliver employment growth, it might actually not be the best way of doing that. So I would always really encourage you to go look at the evaluation evidence in order to understand what the likely impact of a public investment project would be. So that's us. I'm going to stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Victoria. Hopefully we'll get a few more questions once we start talking through the first one, which is, does increase in output locally through construction also increase productivity? And I think also this is a really useful way for us to start doing what you've suggested and kind of thinking through, well, what might those economic impacts be of something like construction jobs?
Yeah. So the answer is maybe, but you would need to work out. So let's think about this. So let's say productivity levels on average where, so each person who's employed in the local area produces goods worth £50,000 per year, okay? If the new construction jobs have a productivity of, let's say, just because the maths are as easy, of £70,000, then like even if they're quite a small proportion of total jobs, they're going to push your productivity up. Clearly, the larger the share of your total output they are, if they're higher productivity, they're going to pull your numbers up, okay? You get into all sorts of kind of complicated things because like the output, so it might be that a lot of the local suppliers are, either at the very high end of your productivity kind of supply chain or at the lower end. So you kind of really need to understand what's happening and how much of how much of total output is that going to be, and then how that's going to impact. So yes, potentially, but also no, potentially, just depending on the nature of the project. And I think the other thing is, I've kind of talked about this very much in a sense of, kind of construction projects, with a transport spin. Clearly, this is very different from something where it's perhaps an R&D project, or, it's about investment into some kind of software. So if it's software, it's probably not going to increase your output very much because it's nearly always going to be bought from somewhere else. So there's all sorts of different dynamics at play.
Well, I guess also in some instances, it could decrease total productivity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if we said, actually, we want to do a massive jobs program, which there were some efforts to do that like in the 80s, we might say, okay, folks, we're not using machines, back to shovels. We're going to provide loads of people with manual jobs. We could actually end up with more people in work, more people being paid, but actually the work that they're doing is less productive, less efficient.
Yeah, so I suppose I think the really classic example of that is the New Deal in the US in the 30s off the back of the Great Depression. I'd like to think that we're not going to ever get to the point again where we do those kinds of job creation policies just for the sake of job. That we're not going to build, I don't know, the Hoover Dam. Well, actually, no, the Hoover Dam's a bad example because the Hoover Dam actually has massive kind of economic contributions. But I'm sure in America, there were lots of projects that, so this is the thing, right? For you to have those kind of second and third order effects, so the ones where, you're impacting on the productivity of the business, of your business base, where you're perhaps inducing kind of behavior change, they need to be good quality projects. Okay, you must probably get some output benefits from something that actually isn't a great, project. But definitely the second and third categories, they need to be things that are sensible, have good returns on investments.
Okay, so we have another question about available data.
Yep.
How reliable is the available data on local economic impact of different interventions? So thinking about, so they give the examples of regeneration or transport infrastructure investment.
Yeah, so I would argue, so when we're looking at evaluation evidence, we are looking at stuff from experimental and quasi-experimental designs. They are the most robust kinds of evaluations that you can have. For most of the stuff that we're talking about here, you're not going to get an experimental design. We do not run a randomized control trial on where we build train lines, for example, but we've got lots of quasi-experimental, which is like the second, the silver medal position for robustness. So it's good. The question I would so there's two issues. One is we just don't have enough studies. okay, which is one of the reasons that anyone who engages with me and Megan on a relatively regular basis knows that the thing we bang on about is, oh, could that program be evaluated? Because that's about adding to our evidence base. The second thing is, of the stuff we've got, how transferable it is. So with one exception, I think, all the studies in our rail investment are either from the US or from Europe, okay? So US, as an example, doesn't actually have much public transport infrastructure. And where it does have public transport infrastructure, it tends to be in major cities, in New York, in Atlanta. So there's a real question about how comparable is that to if we improve, a rural line in, Dartmoor, for example. So it's robust. The problems are actually how much we have of it and how transferable it is are the issues, actually.
Right. We've got two minutes and two questions. So
okay,
one, I think, is a bigger question about how do we, how might the analysis change in terms of revenue investment? I'm going to put that to one side, and we might come back to that either on K-Hub or in a blog or in a future event. So I'm going to put that to one side. But we have another one, which is catalytic investment. So they say, I hear people talk about catalytic investment. What does it mean?
So I'm going to use an example. I'm the daughter of an engineer. My father worked on building the Channel Tunnel between England and France. That's a pretty catalytic, I'm not sure I can actually say that word, that's in that category. Similarly, I would argue something has to be really substantially large, okay? And it's got, I think, to genuinely be catalytic, it has to be moving those second and third, so the medium and longer term things. It can't just be about the construction phase. It's got to be something that actually is going to kind of change the economic dynamics of an area in some kind of substantive way. I'd say there's very, very few things, because of the point I made earlier about growth accounting. I don't actually think there are very few projects that are genuinely catalytic. So, for example, in London, Elizabeth Line has been a massive project and a really successful project. It's got really high usage levels, seems to be having an impact on the economy. But even that is not a catalytic impact on London. It's a really positive project to have been taken forward. But even that, I don't think is catalytic. But I don't know, maybe there is, maybe transport people have an actual definition for that. But it's a bit scale.
Okay, we've got even more good questions. We might have
Put your questions in earlier.
Well, and I think maybe we should have a webinar which is specifically kind of an ask me anything style event, and folks get to ask all the questions they want, and we'll see how many we can get through. But in the meantime, you're going to have to wait. Check out our blogs, check out our newsletter, check out the new investment guide. Join khub.net, where we'll be answering both the questions that have been answered and others. We will be doing more webinars. Just where you can find this stuff. So K-Hub is our online forum for folks specifically who are working as local government. You can't join if you're a civil servant or if you're a consultant. Apologies. That's khub.net. There's a link in the chat. You're also going to find our how-to guides, both the new one in investment that's not yet published, plus the existing ones that Victoria's already mentioned. Those are on the resource library part of our website. You'll also find their core concepts. So if you were thinking, what the heck is deadweight? Or I don't think I really understand multipliers. We have really short blogs that give you an overview of all of those, all through the resource library part of our website. Do sign up for a newsletter if you're not already on that. This recording, if you want to rewatch it, if you want to share it with people, it's on our YouTube page. And we'll also embed it on this event on our website as well. Other than that, we are going to leave you at this point. Stay cool, and hope to see you
literally and metaphorically.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And we will hopefully see you at another event or training in the future. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.